Fabulous scholars, it's time for another episode of Cooking Up Weather with Ms. Lund. Today, it looks like rain. That can only mean one thing. We are going to be learning about precipitation, the water that falls out of clouds. So to get us started, you're going to need a few simple ingredients that you probably have around your house. The first, and possibly the most important, is of course a cloud. Now, I know we learned that clouds aren't really fluffy, although they look like it. So you're going to have to use your imagination. Pretend that this is very wet and damp, more like a sponge than a cloud. And they're going to be up in the sky, not too high. There, just about right. Now, in the cloud, it will be very easy to find some water vapor. So I like the blue colored water vapor. It makes me think more of water, even though it's more often clear. I also have, for variety, some ice crystals. You can find those in a cloud as well. And the last ingredient we're going to need today is some dust. Now, the dust is optional, but I think you'll find that this makes a great way for your water vapor to condense a little bit faster. And so just like when we made the cloud with the high pressure and the low pressure, remember in the pop bottle? Having a little bit of dust to get that cloud started helps with making precipitation. All right, so let's get started. So for our first type of precipitation, I'm going to start with a traditional rain. And so I'm going to start with a little speck of dust. Everybody sees a little speck of dust here. It doesn't have to be too fancy. This one just happens to have a hole in the middle. It doesn't need to. And then the water vapor is just going to start connecting to the dust. There we got some water vapor, got some more water vapor joining on. And now as more water vapor comes, it starts to join onto itself. There we go. Look at that, starting to make a raindrop. Can you still see the dust in the middle? All right, more water vapors coming, just more and more and more. And if the wind is really, oh no, I dropped some water vapor. If the wind is really strong, you might end up with quite a lot of water vapor stuck around your piece of dust. But eventually it's going to get too heavy to stay up in the cloud. Look at this nice raindrop there. You can kind of still get a hint of the piece of dust in the center. We've got this up in the cloud, all this water vapor around the piece of dust. And when it gets too heavy, it's going to fall or precipitate. Again, if there's a lot of wind, maybe it stays longer in the cloud and a little bit more water vapor joins on. All right, and it gets even a little bit bigger. Wow, then you might have quite some big raindrops falling. And have you noticed this, scholars? Sometimes when it rains, it's tiny little drops and you hardly feel it. Sometimes we call that misting. And other times it's big, fat raindrops that are falling. That just means there was more wind in the cloud to keep the water vapor up so that it could condense a little bit more and make a bigger raindrop. Oh, isn't that beautiful? Very wet. All right, scholars, now you're probably thinking, okay, Ms. Lund, that's great, traditional, I like it. But what about something else? What about something a little bit maybe prettier? Oh, scholars, I am glad you asked, because now we're going to talk about snow. This time, just to be different, I'm going to have it start around a piece of water vapor. So snow forms the same way as rain up in the clouds, but instead of just the water vapor glomming on any way that it wants to, it freezes in a crystalline pattern. If you've ever seen Frozen, when Elsa's making her castle, those are crystalline patterns. So I'm going to add some ice crystals now because my water vapor is freezing. And I'm trying to work very hard to make a nice pattern. I'm not sticking them on any way that I want. See, I'm starting to get a little bit of a pattern here. And then some more patterns. Look at all these ice crystals just condensing around my water vapor. Ooh, it's a little bit cold. I probably should have worn mittens. And it just keeps spreading. And just like with the rain, if the wind is, oh no, I broke my snowflake. If the wind is strong enough, then it can grow pretty big. And you've probably noticed this with snowflakes too. Some snowflakes are very small and some snowflakes are larger. Now I have a finished snowflake I'd like to show you just because it can take some time to make them. But notice the beautiful patterns, right? All the way around, almost like I was following some instructions while I made this. Much, much different than the raindrop where the water vapor just glommed on in any way that it could. You get these nice patterns. Now, people sometimes say no two snowflakes are alike. Well, there are a lot of patterns and a lot of ways snowflakes can form. Maybe it's possible that two of the snowflakes are the same. You should check it out the next time it snows. I still have, this time instead of water vapor, I have a little ice crystal being where it condensed around, but I still have precipitation. And when it gets too heavy, it falls from the cloud. So we've done rain and we've done snow. Both of them started with a piece of dust or a tiny piece of water vapor, and then more water vapor or frozen water vapor collected around it. The raindrop just smashed right in there, and the snowflake, it formed in a beautiful pattern spreading out. By the way, I almost forgot to mention, most snowflakes have either 8 or 6 arms to help with that pattern. So check that out the next time it snows. All right, we have 2 more kinds of precipitation though that can fall from clouds. Rain and snow are probably the most common, and we see both of those a lot in Minnesota. But you can also get something called hail. And hail forms almost the exact same way, right? Which we start with today. Oh, let's start with a little bit of dust, right? A little bit of dust. And then the water vapor just starts condensing around it. But as the water vapor condenses around it, it freezes. Maybe it's very, very cold in the cloud. It's not freezing in a pattern though, not like a snowflake. It's just freezing around. So it's condensing. That's what condensing is, getting close to it, right? So almost have enough water vapor here condensing around it. All right, so let's say this. We've got this. It looks almost like a raindrop, but instead of staying liquid, it freezes. It's quite hard now. Hear it? And the wind is blowing, and so it doesn't fall. It doesn't precipitate. It just stays up there in the cloud long enough for another layer of water vapor to form around it. This time I'm going to use some of my ice crystals. And so the ice crystals are now forming all the way around the outside of it. Not making a pretty pattern like the snowflake, but just adding another layer. If you've ever made a candle where you dip the wick into the melted wax, and at first there's just a little bit of wax on the wick, and then you keep dipping it and keep dipping it, and then another layer adds and another layer adds, and it keeps getting thicker and thicker and thicker, that's what's happening to hail. Can you see how the water vapor now is being covered up with my layer of ice crystals? And again, if the wind is really strong inside the cloud, that just continues. They could have more and more and more layers. And if you look it up on the internet, you can see hailstones, that's what these things are called, hailstones, that are huge. Sometimes they're the size of tennis balls or even bigger. No, that's very dangerous weather. Most hailstones are probably more about the size of a Lego. Not too big, hard enough that they'd hurt if they hit you because they're ice, right? But if you break open a hailstone, if you were able to cut it down the middle, you would see the different layers formed on it. So it would start off small, but then the wind keeps it up in the cloud and it's cold enough that more layers of water vapor can form on it, and then more layers, and then more layers, and then more layers. Imagine how strong the wind would have to be to keep a huge hailstone in the cloud. Oh my goodness. So then eventually it precipitates. Often hail happens with a mix of rain as well. All right, so we have done rain, we have done snow, we have done hail. There is one more main kind of precipitation called sleet. And sleet is just a fancy way of saying rain that freezes as it falls. So it forms like a raindrop in the cloud. Let's see, I'm going to start with an ice crystal this time just for fun. And then my water vapor is going to condense around it, not forming a nice pattern like the snowflake, but just getting there, condensing around it. And when it gets heavy enough, it will fall, precipitate from the cloud, but as it falls, meaning the colder air is underneath the clouds, it freezes. And then it comes down, and it feels more like little tiny pellets of ice rather than rain. So it's not liquid like rain is. It's harder, can you hear that? But it didn't freeze up in the clouds like hail. Hail freezes in the clouds, sleet freezes as it falls. Miss Lund, really? Can people tell the difference? Well, sure. Remember hail, if you cut the hailstone open, you can see the layers that were formed on it. If you were able to cut sleet open, which is a little harder because it's usually much, much smaller because it was just a frozen raindrop, there aren't any layers. You just see ice. All right, fabulous scholars. I hope that helped you think about precipitation. I hope you try to make some of your own precipitation at home. Remember, you need clouds, water vapor, and possibly, just to make it fancy, some dust and some ice crystals. And as the water vapor condenses around either more water vapor or the dust or the ice crystals, depending on how it condenses, how it collects, decides what kind of precipitation you get. If it just gloms on there and then falls, rain. If it forms a lovely pattern, which is now falling apart, sorry scholars, snow. If it freezes in lots and lots of layers, hail. And if it looks an awful lot like a raindrop, but then as it falls it freezes, sleet. So the next time precipitation starts coming from a cloud, check it out. See if you can figure out which kind it is. All right, scholars, until next time, happy cooking up some weather.